Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Jackie Kemp. I'm a content writer and journalist with an interest in Scottish affairs. And our guest tonight is Linda Fabiani, who needs very little introduction. Linda. She's a former MSP and was Deputy Presiding Officer at Holyrood. Linda, good evening.
Hello there.
So we'll just launch in with Ukraine update to day 289, just to keep you updated about what's going on there. Russian forces have shelled the entire front line in the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine. The governor, Pavlo Kirilenko, said that the fiercest fighting is near the town of Bakhmut, Avdiivka. Then other stories, there are US basketball star Brittany Griner was released in a prisoner swap with Russia in exchange for former arms dealer Victor Bout, and is heading back to the United States on Thursday, ending what President Joe Biden called months of hell for her and her wife. Russian forces installed multiple rocket launchers at Ukraine's shut down Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, according to Ukrainian officials. Ukraine's state-run power agency, Energoatom, has accused Russian forces of abducting two senior Ukrainian staff at the Zaporizhzhia plant. Vladimir Putin said ultimately an agreement will have to be reached to end the conflict in Ukraine, but he's wary of doing so following the Minsk agreement. Putin also said Russia may cut oil production and will refuse to sell any oil to any country that imposes the G7's price cap on its oil. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Thursday the US is confident that Finland and Sweden will be approved soon for membership of NATO, despite ratification delays from Turkey and Hungary. The US is preparing to send Ukraine a $275 million military aid package, offering new capabilities to defeat drones and strengthen air defences. The UK Ministry of Defence said that Russia has likely received a resupply of Iranian Shahed 131 and 136 loitering drone munitions. About 10,000 Ukrainian service personnel and roughly the same number of Ukrainian civilians are believed to be being held in Russian detention facilities, according to Alexander Konyenko, a Ukrainian human rights official. A Russian court has sentenced the opposition politician Ilya Yashin to 8.5 years in prison on charge of spreading false information meant to discredit the Russian army. Russia has told Zambia it pardoned a Zambian student to go and fight in Ukraine, where he was killed, according to the Zambian Foreign Affairs Minister. Pope Francis broke down and wept as he prayed for peace in Ukraine during a traditional Christmas visit to the Spanish Steps in Rome. Russian athletes have been offered a path to compete at the Paris 2024 Games, even if the war in Ukraine continues to rage for another 18 months. It's an ongoing struggle in Ukraine. We'll come back to one of those stories later. But first of all, I think we were going to talk about Mari Black, who asked Rishi Sunak what the democratic route to Scottish independence might be. The SNP's new deputy leader in Westminster challenged Rishi Sunak to clarify whether he agrees with Alistair Jack and Michael Gove that if an independence referendum is the settled will of the Scottish people, one will occur. In a letter to Sunak, Mari Black asked the Prime Minister if he stands by that policy as suggested by his ministerial colleagues. And that comes 2 days after, of course, the polls showing that independent support has risen to 56%. And support for the SNP at Westminster over half at 51%. Mari Black said, on 2 separate occasions, my colleague Dr. Philippa Whitford asked the Prime Minister what the democratic route for Scotland to choose her independence is, and on both occasions he failed to answer. That's why I'm challenging the Prime Minister to confirm whether or not he agrees with his ministerial colleagues that an independence referendum will occur if it's the settled will of the Scottish people. And this time, instead of helplessly hiding behind the Supreme Court, the Prime Minister could actually show leadership and outline exactly how Scotland can choose to exercise its democratic right in this so-called voluntary union. However, the Prime Minister must be in no doubt that for every day Scotland's democracy is denied, the stronger our case will grow. What do you think about that, Linda?
Well, it's the ongoing saga of it, and Mary's quite right. The rhetoric that they use is all about democracy, and then they refuse Scotland to the democratic process and can't even answer what they believe the democratic process to be. Now, to me, it's very obvious, and the international community make it very obvious, a referendum. people having the right to decide their own future. It's what's always put forward as the democratic process. But of course, the Tories, the Tory government, just keep denying that. Even though, as Mary said, Michael Gove and even Alistair Jack have said in the past, this, if it's the settled will, it should happen. So the question all comes down to what is the settled will? And they keep changing the
Yes.
goalposts and making their own decision on that. And, I think back to when the Scottish Parliament first was reconvened and Donald Dewar was the First Minister, and he was very, very plain, that devolution wasn't a one-off event. It wasn't an event. It was a process that was ongoing. And, he, in a few occasions, I heard him and then heard him being reported as talking about democratic will, people's right to self-determination. So what actually stuns me more than the Tory government is Keir Starmer and his folk. Lisa Nandy's been particularly harsh on this lately, denying democracy for Scotland. And even worse, Scottish Labour, who sit in Scotland's Parliament, where, we have a majority of elected members who are for independence, who still deny the right to choose. Now, I totally understand that there are people who will always vote no to Scotland becoming independent for their own reasons, and they're entitled to them. What I cannot understand are those who would deny the democracy of a referendum for people to decide and for that majority decision. Time's gone on and on, so it's absolutely ridiculous that they keep on doing this. And I think we have to keep them under pressure, Jackie. You talk about democracy. So where's the democracy for Scotland? They like to say, oh, a referendum's illegal. No, it's not. I mean, that's just complete and utter nonsense. What the Supreme Court basically said was that it doesn't matter what Scotland thinks. The sovereign UK Parliament can override it. Scotland has
Yeah.
been extinguished, to use a language from a couple of hundred years ago. So, how are we supposed to exercise democracy? I think the settled will of the Scottish people towards a referendum is that they keep voting for parties that are very, very clear that they believe the referendum should happen. If it's not that, what the heck is it?
I think a lot of people were surprised. I mean, I was surprised with the Supreme Court judgment. I wasn't surprised that they said that Holyrood didn't have the right to hold a referendum, but I was really surprised that they said that Scotland doesn't have the international right to self-determination. That was a bit of a shocker.
Absolutely. And what they did was, I think they actually, I couldn't quote it, the line or the clause, but they actually likened us to Quebec. And I think that's ludicrous as well, because when you look at the history of Quebec in Canada and Scotland as a so-called equal partner in a union, a voluntary union, how does that equate? It doesn't equate as far as I'm concerned.
No,
And I
I
really
think
do
that's. I
think the
think that.
onus is on them to justify it.
Yeah, I think, and there was a lawyer who picked them up in Prospect magazine saying that, saying exactly that really, and saying that they hadn't really confronted the underlying issue, which is that Scotland has this ongoing relationship with the UK, which has always been thought to be voluntary. So what do you think this? What do you think the settled will would look like then? Just another couple of elections, and you think they might
Well,
agree by
not
then?
even a couple. I mean, I think when you have a party that's the SNP, which nobody can deny that the SNP's um, prime policy is that Scotland should be an independent nation. Everybody knows that. And when you have another party like the Greens, who have had independence, as their policy as well for many, many years now, when a majority of independentistas are elected to a national parliament, to me, it's the settled will of the Scottish people at that time that a referendum should occur. Now, you can't expect people's settled will to be the same for centuries. That's just ludicrous. People are entitled to change their mind. I mean, we've seen Tory politicians and most of the Labour politicians have changed their mind about Brexit, for example. So
Yes,
why is it only Scotland that's not allowed to change its mind?
that's a really good point. That's a really good point. And you know, I suppose the new team at Westminster will have to kind of carry the ball forward in terms of keeping them under pressure.
Absolutely. Keep
And the
at
Labour
it.
Party, as
Keep
you say.
Well, they disappoint me, Jackie. I've said it before. The Tories the current Tories don't surprise me in any way at all because I think they're just vile, and I think they have no ethics. The
Yeah.
Labour Party, I keep hoping, stand for something. To me, at the moment, all they seem to stand for is getting back in power.
Do you think they've given up on Scotland? Do you think they're actually aiming their
Yeah.
sort of rhetoric, their anti-Scottish rhetoric, at kind of Scotophobic red wall voters?
Well, I thought it was really interesting that even Professor John Curtis, who has always been very, very fair, for him to actually come out and say it was, I think I'm paraphrasing him. Said it's quite clear that Labour were looking at the red wall in the north of England and round about and giving up in Scotland. I think when he comes to that conclusion, that says a heck of a lot. I've
And
thought it for
can
years too.
yeah,
Mm.
yes. Well, that's a kind of an explanation, isn't it? Because I think
Yeah,
the polling seems to show that their tactics not doing very well in Scotland. Do you think they can win without Scotland?
I think when you look at the figures previously, previous elections and opinion polls going forward and things at the moment, yes, they can, and I think that's maybe a judgment they have made.
Well, the
Um,
Tories win without
and
Scotland all the time, so I suppose Labour can do that too.
yeah, yeah.
So, well, that just takes us into the next story, going back to the Conservatives, which is the Chancellor has unveiled some financial deregulation, which I refuse to call the Edinburgh reforms. It was called
Mhm.
Big Bang 2.0, and he decided that if he travelled to Edinburgh and announced them, he could call them but they've nothing to do with Edinburgh. So he's unveiled some regulatory deregulation, essentially, which he claims and his government claims will unlock investment. Lots of people are very sceptical of that. Lots of people think it's a kind of desperate measure to rescue the City of London, which has suffered a lot from Brexit. It's lost 80,000 jobs. Paris overtook it as the biggest, as the most
Mm.
valuable stock exchange last month. Last year, Amsterdam overtook it as the busiest. Wall Street has taken a lot of derivatives trading. So this is a kind of slightly desperate response, and it includes a commitment to make substantial progress over repealing some rules about insurers' balance sheets, which they say will unleash investment in productive assets such as infrastructure. But part of that is reducing the amount of deposits which are ring fenced, which was introduced by the UK after 2008. And there was also a lot of criticism of another change, which is they want regulators to have some responsibility for boosting growth. And a lot of people who work in the banking sector, like in the FT yesterday, someone said that it was pointless and dangerous to do that. Um, we'll quote the SNP MSP Kenneth Gibson said, "It's astonishing that the Tory Chancellor is focused on dishing out yet another boost to wealthy bankers while continuing to let down ordinary struggling families. This, yet again, serves to underline the only way to create a fairer system that works for everyone who lives in Scotland is to become a normal independent country. Removing banking regulations designed to protect savers and the taxpayer was never one of the many so-called benefits of Brexit the Tories promised, nor was it plastered over the side of a bus. It risks repeating the catastrophe of the financial crash in 2008, which led to crippling Tory austerity for millions of households across Britain."
Mhm.
What's your response to this, Linda?
Well, it's just well. First of all, the thing about the Edinburgh, whatever they're calling it, reforms are a pile of nonsense. I mean, do they really think that that's going to go down well in Scotland and make Scotland think that we're important enough uh, to be part
Mm,
of what they do? I really don't get the idea behind this at all. It's nothing to do with Edinburgh. It's a response to what's been happening in London. It's a response to um, all the post Brexit stuff that's been going on, the losses. You outlined them, Jackie. But I'm really quite worried about it, because there were measures put in place to protect ordinary domestic deposits. The ring fencing saying that they couldn't go for riskier investments with them. They've already lifted the cap on bankers' bonuses. I was saying that bankers, and I feel quite bad using the word bankers because there's actually some very, very decent bankers, if you like.
mm,
People who really care about their profession, people who care about those who are investing money with them and saving money with them. But there's a lot of cowboys out there, a lot of spiffs and speculators. We all know that. Now, that's my real concern, that you take these rules away and then we have another crash. I mean, we keep being told what a bad state we're in at the moment, recession coming, all the rest of it. Yet they're looking to lift these regulations. We could end up
yeah,
with ordinary Joe Soap having to pick up the pieces yet again just to
mm,
protect those and such as those that form the elite down in London, whether it be politicians, whether it be media magnates, whether it be those who are making big bucks of speculation.
yeah,
That's what it's about. And I was listening today to a programme, I think it was Radio 4, about the rise and fall of Liz Truss. And I was listening to some of the things that she wanted to do and were stopped. And I'm thinking, do you know what? It's just been postponed.
yeah,
It hasn't been kicked out, it's been postponed. And we're going to get a steady drip, drip of these very right wing economic and financial measures that will look
yeah.
after some people and abandon others.
I guess that was potentially what they saw as the benefit of Brexit. Being sort of Singapore on sea, which has loose regulation, and you know the most money coming to Britain is money laundering. There's a lot of money
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of sloshing about in Britain, which is
Mm-hmm.
pretty dirty money. Um,
Absolutely.
but
Look at
yeah,
all the
I mean, I
offshore
think
stuff.
the Hunt reforms. Let's call them the Hunt reforms or the Rishi Hunt reforms. You have to be
Yeah.
careful how you say that.
Yeah,
Um,
please. I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to say
but
that. The
concerning
idea of it
for lots of
coming up
people,
to
including bankers,
hmm
it's desperate. They're desperate measures, I
hmm
think,
and
because
and it's about the EU financial rules protected some aspects for a long time. And as you say, they wanted Brexit, they wanted to take that away. And the hypocrisy of coming up to Scotland to make these announcements in a country that clearly and unequivocally voted against Brexit is a blooming
mm,
cheek. It really is.
it is a blooming cheek because Edinburgh's the most Remain city in the UK, right? 75% of
Yeah,
people,
yeah.
and I'm sure Edinburgh's financial sector is also being affected by Brexit, but the answer is not to kind of further damage the UK's international reputation
hmm
and kind of make it even easier for money launderers to kind
Yes.
of do what they want. Yeah,
We really need out of this. I just can't understand why, when all these things are happening, people don't just say, look, we need shot of this bunch. Even apart from that very basic, I think my own nation should take its own decisions, and that those who live here should make the decisions as to how the nation goes forward. Even apart from that, there surely must be those who've not really thought about it in that way before, whose head is saying to them, why are we linked up with these people? We really
yeah,
need to get out. We need to forge our own path and show the way that it can be and try and encourage the others on this island
Yeah.
that
It's kind of
UK, Britain.
dishonest. The whole thing's dishonest. I mean, it's dishonest calling it the Edinburgh Reforms when it's got nothing to do with Edinburgh. It's the Hunt Reforms, and it's dishonest saying that it's to do with post-Brexit freedoms because things like ring fencing deposits, the UK did that while it was in the EU. It's got nothing to do with Brexit. So I think
That's
the whole thing is
yeah,
really misleading.
but
A
they do
false
that all the
prospectus.
time. Yeah, they throw
Yeah.
stuff out there, and you have to pick amongst it carefully to see what's actually true, and what is just being disingenuous and what is downright lying, because they do all of these things.
Strategic lying. I think that was they invented that.
Uh,
This bunch of conservatives invented, and it's like strategic lying is you just keep saying things that aren't true, and when
mm,
people pop up and say, "But that's not true," they're still talking on your terms. They're on your turf,
yeah, yeah.
and people just remember, 350,000 or whatever it was for the NHS. They don't remember that it was actually not true.
Well, that's right. And I didn't see lifting banking regulations on the side of a bus going round at Brexit time. They never spoke about that.
No, they never spoke about that. No, they didn't.
No.
Okay, and this is on another. So, with the theme of dishonesty, we're going to move right on to Guardian exposes full Michelle Moan PPE scandal. Late
Mm,
Moan, as they like to call her down south. The Guardian is reporting the full inside of the Michelle Moan PPE scandal. The Guardian has led in its investigation and has revealed in a series of exclusives that PPE MedPro and partners made as much as 100 million in profits. At least 70 million from the PPE MedPro contracts was taken offshore. There's a small electronics firm behind the supply of gowns for the NHS. There was a jet, a yacht, and a racehorse purchased after the PPE deal. Victoria Peer and her husband are now selling yacht and properties. Moan takes leave of absence from the Lords and may leave UK. The Guardian was first to break the story and later revealed that Moan had been aggressively lobbying ministers on behalf of a second company, LFI Diagnostics, which was another secret entity of her husband's family office in the Isle of Man. The Guardian has now revealed previously unreported details about the PPE deal at the heart of the Moan controversy and the enormous profits it appears to have generated, mostly on the back of supplies that have been rejected by the Department of Health and Social Care in a dispute with the company. Moan, Barrowman, PPE Medro, and three other intermediary companies in the supply chain appear to have made in excess of 100 million in profits from government contracts worth 203 million, according to a Guardian analysis. In a business chain that stretches from the Isle of Man to Cyprus, Hong Kong, and then China, and it resulted, it seems, in vast fortunes that were moved offshore. It's being reported that Moan and Barrowman could decide to leave the UK or their Isle of Man tax haven home, and they're unlikely to escape the scrutiny of the UK Parliament. Apparently, Moan remains under investigation by the Lords Commissioner for Standards. That inquiry has been paused due to the separate NCA investigation into Medco. In Westminster, there are growing calls for full disclosure about Moan's interactions with four key ministers: Gove, Agnew, Lord Bethell, and Matt Hancock. There's also growing questions about the government's insistence, repeated so many times since the start of the pandemic, that ministers did not and do not have any role in awarding contracts, and that civil servants were the ultimate decision makers. So the Guardian's done well to expose a lot of this. That's
mm,
really serious, important work.
mm-hmm. Yeah, the
Um,
Guardian are pretty good at investigative journalism. I mean, I have to
it's
say,
expensive.
uh, I think there's too
Mm,
many newspapers these days don't do proper investigative journalism for whatever
yeah,
reasons. Yeah,
they just don't
Guardian's
have
pretty
the
good.
funding. It's
Yeah,
very expensive because you can't guarantee that it's going to turn anything up. You have to give people time to look at
yeah,
things.
yeah.
It
And you
takes
don't
a lot
always
of money
get
into
that. But the Guardian's pretty good, and they have
yeah.
been quite relentless in this, because there was a lot of time there, Jackie, where many people, were saying, why is this not getting properly investigated? Why we keep hearing these things? Nobody's really looking at it. There was the Guardian busying away in the background and doing it. I mean, I didn't, it's a huge article today in the Guardian. I didn't get the chance to really study it, but I managed to look over it. And, you know, two things struck me. The irony of this being reported on a day when you've got Conservative government going to lift banking regulations. Because whilst this is not about any particular bank, in fact, I understand it was HSBC that kicked off some of the stuff because they had concerns. But it's when you look at that chain that you mentioned, from Isle of Man to Cyprus, all round the houses, trying to hide, allegedly, what is actually going on. And you then talk about lifting regulations, which I think would just make that kind of thing easier. So that's one of the ironies. The other thing I keep thinking is, well, what's going to happen to them? What are the sanctions here? It's got a long way to go, this story. More
I mean,
power to the Guardian's for carrying on
yeah,
with it.
because it's quite
What
appalling. Why is the
it
Parliament?
is.
Why is the Parliament not? I mean, why is it left to the Guardian? Which is funded by all of us with our donations. But if Parliament, why is? I mean, for a start, why is Lady Moan in our legislature in the first place? I mean, she has more
Well, there's that.
constitutional rights than Nicola Sturgeon
But
does.
there's also, you know, why are somebody sitting in the unelected House of Lords able to say, "Oh, I would like leave of absence, and I'm going to go away and sort this out"? Why was she not kicked out in her bahookie and suspended the minute this stuff came up as a possibility?
I mean, I don't
I
understand
don't.
why. I mean, I cannot see any argument for somebody like that being in our legislature, having the constitutional right to amend and debate legislation that affects Scotland when the Scottish Parliament doesn't have that right. And there's a number of laws that have been passed. It's like, why, Lady Moore, why? I mean, what possible reason can there be for her to be there? And it's just, I think the whole thing is just absolutely scandalous. The whole thing is
Well, it
extraordinary.
brings it right back to the whole anomaly of the House of Lords in the first place. In this day and age, what is a so-called democracy doing with an unelected second chamber, which some people there by dint of birth, but other people there because they're cronies of those who are in power in the House of Commons?
Well, the Labour
It's
Party made it worse
absolutely.
because in 1997
Uh-huh.
they didn't really reform it. They mounted a kind of power grab because the hereditary peers didn't tend to vote Labour, and they instituted this current system, which means that that the leader of the party can appoint who he basically likes, like Lord Evgeny Lebedev of Siberia, who's bankrolled by a
It's
KGB agent that Boris Johnson met. The House of Lords is full of
pissed
people
off.
like that.
Mhm. But then you've also got a so-called radical Labour Party now, uh, who are saying we're going to abolish the House of Lords, and then when their sole Westminster representative in Scotland was questioned in an interview, I didn't see it myself, but I've heard others talking about it. When they said, how can we be sure you're going to abolish the House of Lords, And he said, well, it's been in our manifesto for 105 years. Yeah,
Nobody
there's the
thinks
point.
nobody thinks they're going to abolish the House of Lords. I mean, Gordon Brown might think it, but I mean, that report was commissioned when they were nowhere near election. They were nowhere near victory. But the closer they get, the more pushback there is. Nobody thinks they're going to do that. I mean, they're not going to
No.
abolish the House of Lords because the English don't want to abolish the House of Lords. If they were serious about the union with Scotland, they probably would, but they're not, so they won't. There's just no way that there's the kind of energy that would be needed down there. And I think one of the things that we see is that because independent supporters don't take positions in the House of Lords, there's increasing divergence between Scotland and England
Yeah,
on that.
yeah,
But I mean, yeah, I think the whole thing. I think one of the things that I find absolutely scandalous about this is that the UK Parliament has had, it seems, no role in uncovering this scandal. It's been the
yeah.
Guardian.
That is scandalous in itself.
It is. I mean, so much for their regulation. Okay, and then we sort of move on to another scandal, which is that
Oh,
the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's probably is one of the people that still sits in the House of Lords by reason of their other position, and complicates the situation. Um, so he opens a debate annually, I think, in the House of Lords, and he in this occasion, he chose to criticise the government over its asylum policy, and he accused the government of cruelty. And he said people smuggling is as serious as slave trading in the 19th century. Um, Opening a debate in the House of Lords on Friday with a rebuke aimed at the Home Secretary Suella Braverman, Justin Welby said the harmful rhetoric that those arriving in the UK are invaders must cease. Politicians and the public must reject the shrill narratives that all who come to us for help should be treated as liars, scroungers, or less than fully human, he said. An asylum policy must be based on the moral values of compassion and recognising human dignity. A hostile environment is an immoral environment. Much of the public and political debate around immigration is driven by fear, Welby said. Some of these fears are understandable. Many people are concerned that our communities and local services risk being overwhelmed. However, he continued, when we fail to challenge the harmful rhetoric that refugees are the cause of the country's evils, they should be treated as problems, not people, and as invaders to be tackled and deterred, we deny the essential value and dignity of fellow human beings. Meanwhile, Labour had said it would rush through asylum applications from people from countries they deem to be safe, so they can be swiftly decided and returned. According to Yvette Cooper's Labour Shadow Home Secretary, she said she wanted to create a new system under which the Home Office would prioritise some claims and process them within days. Yeah, so the way that they've been talking about asylum seekers as invaders is
Mhm,
horrific, isn't it?
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I looked at what Justin Welby had said because this is a subject that I care about very deeply. And regardless of where he said it, he's a prominent man. I think he's basically a decent man. And he didn't say anything I could disagree with. Um, I thought that his language was pretty strong for someone in his position. I'm glad it was because I, I just think that the current UK government, um, now at the moment in the person really of Suella Braverman, is just appalling. And I was quite pleased that he focused on the rhetoric because it's disgusting the way they talk about people. Now, disgusting that they'd be talking about people who are fleeing danger and taking huge risks with their lives.
Yeah,
To talk about them as invaders and everything else. But do you know what? See, even if it's someone who is coming here as what they call an economic migrant, see, even if it's someone who just thinks that they can maybe do better things for their family by coming here and are not actually an asylum seeker, they still shouldn't be talked about like that because this country has been built on people who have chosen to give themselves better lives in their eyes. Scotland and England and Wales and Ireland have been noted for the amount of immigration, over the years to other places to try and give themselves a better life. And they should not be talked about as invaders. They should not be referred to as liars, scroungers, and almost subhuman. It's absolutely disgusting. And I'm glad that
it's
Justin
really
Welby has
upsetting.
called it out.
Really upsetting.
Sorry, Jack. Yeah.
I was reading the other day that they've the Home Office is taking away child status. Even some child refugees who come with papers showing that they're 15, they've said, no, you're 18 because you look 18. And I was talking to a friend of mine whose son, she's Italian, and her son, when he was 12, he was like shaving. And we were saying, your son would never, if he'd arrived and he was 12, the Home Office would like have said, well, you're 18. So it's terrible. How can
It's
they be
disgusting.
treated like that?
It's absolutely disgusting, and there's concerns that hate crime, racism, and stuff is rising. I lay that firmly at the door of the UK government because of the way they talk about people. It's like they are lesser, and it upsets me too that you look at the Rwanda policy and you can't even get Labour to come out and condemn it. You know,
No, and isn't it
they don't
so
condemn
strange that
anything. It's horrible, and it's back to that thing about they're looking at the red wall in England and thinking, we can take government in the UK if we win back these people. And they've adopted the rhetoric of the
Yeah.
Tories. And how they can sleep at night, I have no idea.
Isn't it so?
Um,
Because Suella Braverman's parents, were they not like did they not come as maybe not refugees, but they sought refuge in the UK? It's
well,
so strange.
yeah, but I mean, my grandfather was Italian and came from a village in Italy that has a street called Ecos, because every single family in Stadamelli uh, had family members who went to Scotland. And, they were poor at that time. They came to try and get a better life. And I remember when Brexit was coming about, I was really, really upset. And I couldn't quite work out why I was so upset about this. And I realised that part of it was my own family. Where would I be if some of the stuff that was being said at that time, then the Windrush scandal about immigrants and stuff, and it's just carried on for years and years and years about how
I know.
anybody who doesn't happen to be British and proud of it is somehow lesser. And I
I
think
think
it's
the right wing
absolutely,
media has got something to say to has got some
yeah, but it's
responsibility for
politicians
that.
that feed it. Politicians feed that. I've
Yeah.
often thought it's difficult to know what comes first. Is it the
Uh,
the right wing press rhetoric, or is it the rhetoric from those in power? And they're all one and the
yeah.
same at the end of the day. Yeah.
It's and it is something that you find in all countries, but I think it's poisonous. Really, it's poisonous. There's no safe routes.
Well,
That's another thing.
that was the other thing Justin Welby said. At the end of his talk, he said a few things that could be done. Let's look at safe passage provision, because Suella Braverman admitted a couple of weeks ago there was no such thing.
Yeah.
Family reunification has got to be important. But the other thing he
Mm,
said that really hit home for me was he talked about effective triaging on arrival. And that leads right into the fact that most of the problem is caused by the sheer incompetence over years of what has been happening in the system. The amount of time people have to wait,
mm,
the backlog in applications, the number of appeals that are successful for asylum, you know,
yeah.
it just shows you that the whole system is. I'm trying to
Broken.
think of a word I can say that's polite, uh, and and they do nothing to stop that. They
I
do
know.
nothing to make
And
it better. They just put the blame on what I would now call victims who come here, because even if they weren't victims before they arrived, they end up as victims when they get to the UK.
yeah, it's horrific. And Britain doesn't even take that many
No,
refugees compared to other
the myth,
countries.
the myth that
Yeah.
everybody comes here, complete nonsense.
Okay. So I think we could we should probably speak about that for the rest of the evening, but we'll
Oh,
move on. The BBC's appointed one of the UK's most well-known private equity barons, Sir Damon Buffini, as its deputy chair in the latest move to sharpen the corporation's commercial focus as the government pursues an overhaul of the licence fee. Buffini's appointment comes days after Michelle Donnellan, the culture secretary, told a committee of MPs it remains committed to changing the data by 2027. Options that have been mooted include a fee added to council tax, broadband, access to content on paid tiers based on a Netflix-style subscription. The BBC brought in 3 billion from the license fee last year. I mean, actually, Scotland has a much higher percent of people who don't pay the license fee than any other part of Britain. I think it's about 14% or something, very high. And that's partly because the sanctions are different here. But I guess public service broadcasting in an independent Scotland, you might want to have some public service broadcasting. So how would you fund it?
well, I mean that's the thing, isn't it? And I think that's the crux of the matter. Whether public service broadcasting is something that a nation wishes to have. And if you are having public service broadcasting, then you have to fund it. So, how do you do that? I am personally, and it's entirely personally, um, I don't have a problem with paying a license fee for public service broadcasting. It's a personal thing, because I can't stand advertising, um, interruptions from advertising. So, but I'm fortunate that I would be able to pay for that license. So there has to be provisions in place that allows those um, who find it difficult to pay for a license to be helped, because I think that everybody is entitled to public service broadcasting. There's lots of ways you could look at it. Public prescription, for example, other ways. How it will happen in an independent Scotland, that would be yet to be determined, whether it would be, and determined how it would be paid for if it were. So I personally believe in public service broadcasting. The BBC, as it is just now, I have concerns about. Um, I noticed this new chap that's gone in as vice chair, as what was he, an equity banker or something.
Yeah,
But the
he's
current chairman, yeah,
yeah,
current chairman is from the same background. So there's
yeah.
obviously a wish from the BBC to open up the commercialisation of it. How they'll do that, I don't know. Production, making programmes, licensing, all these things are in the mix there.
Well,
We're
England may be
supposed
less
to have,
committed to public. Yeah,
yeah, we're supposed to have
Maybe England and
representation.
Scotland will go down different routes. I mean, it's possible that
Yeah,
independent Scotland might be more committed to public service broadcasting. And then
that's
there
right.
might be like a fund that could be shared between newspapers and
Well,
radio
there
and
you go.
television. You know,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Ireland has what do they call the Irish? There's a public service broadcaster in Ireland, isn't there?
RT.
RTE. Yeah, yeah.
RT.
I mean, I have to say, I don't know how that's funded, Jackie. I don't know if you know how that's funded, whether it's a license fee or otherwise. Mhm.
Some countries have moved to taxation. Some countries just do it through taxation. Um,
Well,
so
there you
that's another model. Yeah,
go.
yeah.
But
I
I
mean,
mean,
you can have a
I think
mixture.
in
I
the
don't see why you
idea
can
of
have a
public
mixture.
service broadcast. I mean, it is changing. The fact that we have online stuff and all these different things, it is changing. So,
Mhm.
I think everything's in the mix that would have to be looked at in an independent Scotland.
Yeah, it's an interesting subject. But yeah,
Yeah,
some food for thought
yeah.
an independent Scotland. Um, the Scottish Government support for low income workers. Low income workers who lost earnings when they self isolated after contracting coronavirus have received awards totaling almost £73 million. Temporary self isolation support grant is the longest running scheme of its kind in the UK. It helps those earning less than the real living wage if they can't go to work following a positive PCR test, or if someone they care for has a positive PCR test. So from October 2020 until October 2022, the scheme made more than 150,000 awards, but will close to new applicants on the 5th of January 2023, as most people no longer need to take a COVID test, although people should still stay at home if they feel unwell. Alternative financial support will continue to be available depending on individual circumstances through crisis grants through the Scottish Welfare Fund, statutory sick pay. John Swinney said the self-isolation support grant has provided vital help for those who would find it impossible due to their financial circumstances to follow the health guidance to stay at home if unwell. Stay-at-home guidance has since its launch changed to reflect the prevalence of the virus and actions taken to combat it. So that was a good policy. That's obviously helped a lot of people.
Absolutely. I remember being so relieved when that policy came in. Here in Scotland, when the Scottish Government said, we really have to help people here. There's so many people it helped. It is a policy that comes to a natural end because of the self-isolation issues. But I was really pleased, when John Swinney said that, there was work underway to make sure people can still be helped, because although it's a reserved matter, statutory sick pay and stuff, it's Westminster that decides. For people who are not in secure jobs that end up sick, it's absolutely horrendous. The complete lack of or reduction in their income that happens through that. So, they are looking at the Scottish Welfare Fund. That's always been there. So it's good that that's carrying on, and I hope, when John Swinney, in place
Mhm.
of Kate Forbes, maternity leaves, makes his budget statement, I hope these things will be addressed, because it's really
Yeah,
important. And you know, I'll say for the Scottish Government, they do their best to try and help out as far as possible. Well, I mean, they've done so much in mitigation of Westminster policies. It's, you know, lots and lots of money has been put in that, and they can't mitigate everything. But, you know,
no,
when you look at the Scottish Welfare Fund and Social Security Scotland, they've been doing some really good stuff. And the child payment, of course. So there is a commitment there to do their very best, whether it's mitigation or whether it is additional funding for people.
yes.
They're doing what they can.
Sure, that
Yeah.
means a lot to folk that are in that position. You know, yeah, it's obviously a terrible thing if you're unwell and you're also worrying about your bills and so on. And
Absolutely.
another good news story is that employers across Scotland are being encouraged to close the employment and pay gaps for all ethnicities under a new strategy. A Fairer Scotland for All, an anti-racist employment strategy, sets out the actions the Scottish Government will take and how it will work with employers to make Scotland's workplaces more diverse, fair and inclusive. Maybe they could start with the BBC board, although that's obviously reserved. The strategy will support employers to improve their collection of workforce data, including reporting their pay gap and take action on the findings, take an anti-racist approach to remove barriers in recruitment, retention and progression practices to improve representation of workers, drive cultural, attitudinal and organisational change through building an understanding of the impact of institutional racism and the process and practices in an organisation that lead to the unfair treatment of people on the basis of race. Labour market data and research shows that ethnic minorities are more likely to be paid less and their white counterparts be underemployed or underrepresented at senior level roles and experience workplace discrimination. This new strategy will sit aside the refreshed Fair Work Action Plan, which brings together the Scottish Government's existing Fair Work, Gender Pay Gap and Disabled People's Employment Action Plan. Both have been developed following extensive consultation and engagement with the public, private and third sectors along with trade unions. Richard Lochhead, Employment Minister, said, "Our ambitious plans for Scotland's economy are built on ensuring that everyone can thrive in a diverse, safe and inclusive workplace. The refreshed Fair Work Action Plan and anti-racist employment strategy will further drive these ambitions." So that's another good news.
Yeah, yeah, it's been a long time coming. And that's not a criticism because these things take a long time to put into place, but there's certainly been a lot of investigation, research work carried out over the last few years, uh, both in you know, to recognise exactly what the issues are, and then to try and do something to address them. I mean, from my own point of view, one of the great privileges I had in my last term of Parliament was chairing a policy of the government's and others, which was called Young Women Lead, which was bringing young women from all walks of life together to discuss aspects of policy relevant to them. And one of them was about what we can call institutional racism in the workplace. And it was led by um, great bunch of young women from ethnic minority backgrounds, um, and it had been organised by the YWCA, and they produced a report. Oh my goodness, it was quite damning
Right.
about the issues that were faced in the workplace by ethnic
Sure.
minority people. So there is institutional racism there. It's not always deliberate, and that's one of the
Of
things
course.
that's really
Mm.
hard to, you know, to get round.
Yeah,
So I'm glad this initiative has started, and
that's good.
but the
Yeah.
key to this is not just announcing an initiative and letting it run. It has to be properly monitored, and that can be
Yeah.
quite difficult. But the resource has to be there to allow that to be done, and it
It's,
shouldn't be
yes.
just a tick box exercise
No, it
because,
shouldn't. It
you know,
shouldn't.
that's too
I did.
easy.
Yeah, I did some diversity training with this my US client in the pandemic, and it was actually great. It was really interesting because we actually got to talk to our colleagues who you often just talk to them about work things. You actually got to talk to them about their ethnicity and their experience of racism, and it could just be as simple as like you've got an unusual name and people just constantly make the same jokes, or they didn't bother to learn how to spell it or say it, So I think,
Yeah.
diversity training can be really fun and interesting, and we should maybe just
Yeah,
be a bit more positive about it.
absolutely. And I think there should be, things like particularly, I think in the public sector, because it happens in the public sector as well as private sector. I mean, I think there should be compulsory diversity training and advanced diversity training for anyone who is found to either not quite understand or perhaps deliberately think they shouldn't have to understand.
But I think
I
making it
think it should
compulsory
be in
might,
people's positions. Well, I think
do
it
you not
should
think
be in the
making it compulsory might
positions.
make it feel a bit? I mean, I think that the whole point of it is like, so in our one we had separate. You started off all the sort of white
Uh-huh.
people kind of started off in one group just so that we could do a little bit of research, and so that we weren't going to go in and say, no, where are you really from? So that we could just understand a little bit about the kinds of things that might upset
Yeah.
people. And they had a separate thing, and then we joined together to kind of talk about
Yeah.
different things, about
I mean,
to share
I think,
stories really. But it was
yeah, no,
fascinating.
when I'm saying compulsory, I'm not saying it should be compulsory for everyone. What I'm saying is that sort of thing should happen anyway as part of your
Yeah,
workplace training. But if someone is found further down the line to be a problem for whatever reason in how they deal with people, they should know that the first step after a complaint or an investigation or anything is compulsory further training, and they have to
yeah, I
take it
think
on
training,
board.
because you
That's
can't expect everybody to know. You can't expect
that's
everybody
right.
to know that
Mm.
things have changed, like things have moved on, and people just don't always really understand. So one of the things that you sort of learn is like you don't always have to leave it to the black person or the woman to be to sort of deal with issues of racism, because
Uh-huh.
just if they don't seem to be offended, it doesn't mean that you should all let it go.
Well,
Just
very
in
often
small.
the not seeming to be offended is just a defense mechanism, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
You know,
So
yeah.
yeah, I think we're all learning from each other, and
Mm.
that's
Yeah.
good. So I think that was. There's just one little last story which we don't really have time to do much about, but it's 1.4 million pound support for island communities.
All
Islanders
right.
most impacted by the cost of living crisis will be able to access additional help through the Cost Crisis Emergency Fund, and that's part of the emergency budget review. And Rural Affairs Secretary Mari Gujan said that islanders already experience higher costs of living, 20 to 65% higher, fuel costs, colder climate, lack of consumer choice, and this is a fund to kind of help people, who
Mm-hmm.
must be raging about the energy bills that they have to pay.
Absolutely. No, I really welcome this, and I actually lived on an island for a few years. It was the Isle of Bute. It's an urban island, if you like. We used to call it an urban. What was it? An urban island in a rural setting or something. And so, but things were more expensive there. Life was more expensive there. So
Mm-hmm.
when you then look at both the inner and then the outer Hebrides, for example, it's
Yeah,
even more so. Everything's more expensive. So I think there's 6 local authorities, are getting this funding amongst them. And from what I've seen, they're really welcoming it. There's a recognition
yeah,
that this will be helpful. And I think part of it's to be capital expenditure, and the bulk of it is revenue expenditure. So it'll be
right,
interesting to see that when they look at local needs, and it's up to local
sure.
authorities to look at local needs, what they'll actually use this money for, and to help people, to help the residents on the islands. So yes, it's good news. I'm pleased Mary Goujon's done that.
That's really good. So, and I think that's kind of about it for this evening. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So, to everyone who's donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We've set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. Good night, and thank you for watching.